Welcome everyone to State Policy 101, yet another session presented by NCSL to new legislators and new legislative staff. This one is called Mastering the Legislative Rules. Thanks so much for being here today. I want you to start by just taking a minute and thinking about what you wanted to be when you grow up. Try to picture it in your mind. If you were anything like me, there were probably a million different things that you thought you might want to be. But I bet there are very few of us in this virtual room that dreamed of being an expert in legislative rules and procedure, a legislative ninja, if you will. And yet here we are. I'm Natalie Wood, and I direct NCSL Center for Legislative Strengthening. We are the hub for research, analysis, and consultation on how legislatures operate, both as democratic institutions and as workplaces. And I'm thrilled to be joined today by a great panel that includes Speaker Eric Barlow, who is with the Wyoming House. He has served there since 2012, was elected majority leader in 2019, and was recently elected as Speaker just last fall. I'm also joined by Senate Majority Leader Steve Fenberg from Colorado. He was elected to the Senate in Colorado in 2016 and was first elected Majority Leader in 2018, a position that he holds today. I want to thank them for being here, and we'll have time to speak with them throughout the course of this presentation, and you'll get to hear more from them in just a minute. So we'll be doing a lot of talking today, but first we want to turn to you guys in the audience, and you'll see a series of polls I think at the bottom of your screen. So at this moment, I want you to click on poll 1, and the poll is going to ask you on a scale of 1 to 5, how familiar are you with your legislature or your chamber's rules of procedures? So 1 is not really at all familiar, 5 is I am at ninja level and really don't even need to be here today. And we'll give you a moment to fill out that poll. We need a beat to check out your responses. I can't wait to see what you have to say. So 1 to 5, how familiar are you with your legislatures or chambers rules of procedure? Okay, this is really helpful, guys. I see 0% so far say extremely familiar, and we've got the vast majority of folks saying that you're somewhat familiar with legislative rules and procedure where you're from, and so that's great. I appreciate you doing that. That helps give us a sense of where everybody's coming from as we speak with you today. And perhaps it was unfair to call the session Mastering the Rules, because there's no way I can promise to make everybody an expert today in legislative rules and procedure. You're not going to be ninja level, perhaps. However, today is about getting a sense of the basics and to lay a foundation so that you're well poised to serve as a legislator or staffer. We're going to talk about why it's important to know about rules in just a minute. Two things I want to caution you with going in. Just because you do something a certain way in your legislature or even in your chamber does not mean that everybody else is going to do it the same way. We'll talk a little bit about those nuances and differences because we have 2 speakers from 2 different states, and I'll shed a multi-state perspective where possible. But I think that's really important as you hopefully attend an NCSL meeting in person someday. When you speak with colleagues from other places, one of the best things is that you find that things are not done the same, especially when it comes to the legislative process. We often say there's 99 ways to run a state legislative chamber, and nowhere does it become more evident than when you look at the process. Related to that, terminology matters. So we'll spend a little bit of time talking about terminology today, but it's important to know that when somebody from one state's talking about the enactment of a bill, it's not necessarily going to mean the same thing in another state. What we'll cover today is we're going to talk about 4 W's and 1 D of the legislative process. So we're going to talk about why the rules matter, where you can go for information and insight about the rules, what you need to learn, who you need to talk to or get advice or guidance from. And lastly, we'll talk about 1D. I couldn't quite make the alphabet work in my favor, but we're going to talk about decorum and the importance of decorum. How well a legislature executes its key powers, like appropriating funds or passing laws or balancing out the actions of the executive branch, hinges on its process. And so it's really crucial that you get some understanding of that. And that's a great lead in to that why that I mentioned. At the root of it all, legislative rules and procedures are a tool for effective group action. This is important in a body like a legislative institution. Rules exist to safeguard the rights, privileges, and obligations of all, giving those participating in the process equal opportunity to be heard, to ensure fairness and good faith, and promote full and free discussion. And the actors that get protected in the process involve the majority, which needs the rules to help prioritize and pass its legislative agenda. It protects the minority, who play an important role and give voice to important facets of the process, as well as the majority is working on its bills and the minority is helping with its priorities as well. And it also protects the public, the press, other actors that are crucial to democracy. The rules also help protect the institution, and that's super important as a new legislator or a new legislative staffer. Now that you hold the position you hold, you are a key part in protecting and upholding the institution itself, wherever you hail from, because the rules ensure that hallmarks of democracy are kept in place, like openness, efficiency, and balance. And then politically and strategically, how well the rules are followed or how well they're understood means a great deal to legislation itself. It can mean life or death for a bill. But I can talk about these concepts all I want. It doesn't really become meaningful until you actually hear personal stories. And for that, I'm going to now turn off my slide deck and turn it over to my esteemed panelists, Speaker Barlow and Senator Fenberg. Thanks again for being here today, gentlemen.
Thanks for having us.
Greetings. Thank you.
So I'm going to first turn to you, Speaker Barlow, and give you a shot at this question. Why should new legislators and new legislative staff care about learning the rules?
Why should we care? Why did I care? Because I wanted to make sure that the old guard couldn't pull wool over my eyes. Because sometimes they use procedural things to get things accomplished that don't make sense in our everyday lives. And so understanding those basics, you don't have to understand all the nuances, and I certainly don't. In fact, the 87% that said they somewhat understood their state's rules, I'm in that, and I'm probably at the 1.5 to 2 level. Even though I use them a lot, there's still nuances that you just come along. So why is to make sure you can keep track of those older legislators. That's probably the biggest reason why I think everybody should learn them.
Thank you for that. Majority Leader Fenberg, what would you have to say? How would you respond to that question?
Thanks, Natalie. It's a good question. I mean, the reason to understand them and to know them inside and out is because it's how you can get the job done. It's how you can be effective. And if you don't know the rules very well, you can sort of go with the flow and maybe pass some bills. But you're really not going to get the most out of your role if you're just sort of leaning on others to tell you what to do at each individual turn in the process. I think for the legislators on the call, they know that a bill as introduced is not usually the bill that gets signed by the governor. And what that means is the rules inform every step of the way that does impact how a bill is changed, whether you like it or not as the sponsor. And so, what I would say is the legislative process is meant to be deliberative. It's not meant to be, I've got an idea and I've got the votes, so therefore it's going to pass exactly like I wanted it to pass. The whole point is to deliberate so that you get to a policy solution that is not radical and doesn't have too many changes all at once on a society, but is done in a way that's thoughtful and inclusive of the minority, the majority, stakeholders, et cetera. And that's where the rules come in. It tells you basically a roadmap of how to go about getting a policy passed, even through the thicket of the deliberative process with all of the different various stakeholders and people involved. So it's important to know them, because otherwise I think you can't be all that effective and really pursue the things that made you want to run for office in the first place.
Thank you. Speaker Burler, I had a question about the role the presiding officer plays. And that may be a role both of you have played as far as, controlling debate on the floor or sitting there at the rostrum. But with the title of speaker, that's a unique title. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this issue in the who part of the presentation. But I wondered if you could speak to the role a presiding officer plays in ensuring the rules protect the institution, to the point I made earlier.
Thank you. And so the speaker role, which I've just stepped into, and we've had 9 days of session this year. So let's be clear about what my level of experience is as speaker. So, but I think that for the institution, and this is something that actually I have the book of speakers right over here by me, and every speaker, at the end of their term, they write, tidbits of, advice to the next speaker, So I actually read them yesterday, kind of semi in preparation for this, and semi I should have read it 3 weeks ago before we started our session. But anyway, and it's when I get most out of the 10 or 15 speakers who I read is, the institution matters the most. Our time is small. The institution goes beyond us. We're in our 66th legislature. Colorado is probably similar to that. So that means there were 66 65 that came before our 2 years. And so we have to honor, what they passed down and try to pass on something meaningful to the next folks that occupy these seats. And these seats are ultimately the citizens' seats, right? We're representatives of the citizens. This is the citizens' legislature. This belongs to them. And so to pass something on, we have to attend to those basic things. And I'm glad that the senator talked about process, because the rules really are about the process. They may adjust the product some, or they may influence what the product can do. Let's just take the one subject bill matter. State of Wyoming, we can only have one subject per bill. We don't have omnibus bills. I don't know that all states have that, but that's something that we cherish in Wyoming. And of course, we look at Washington, D.C. and say, I wish they could figure this out. Now, that's not our problem, but I'm just saying, so the point is that as long as we continue to uphold those, not just traditions, but constitutional constraints. And we get called occasionally, hey, this is not within the one subject matter. And the speaker, so here's your question as a speaker, gets to say, is this germane? Is this a single subject? Etc. And you make a ruling as a presiding officer. Now in Wyoming, we have a rules committee. I can poll the rules committee and say, all right, rules committee, it's 13 members of the House out of the 60 we have. So it's a good cross section of our House. And I can say, all right, is this germane or not? They give me advice. So they give the presiding officer advice. I ultimately make the ruling. But here's the best thing about, I think, our system is the body always rules. The body can say, presiding officer, we disagree with your interpretation or your ruling, and we can go to a vote. And last week, I had 2 votes like that. One I ruled one way, and the body upheld it, and one I ruled the other way, and the body said, no, you didn't quite get it. And look, they were by 1 or 2 votes. I mean, so it's a close call on a lot of these things. But I think ultimately that's what upholds the institution. Is it's not just the presiding officer has this, carte blanche. The body can weigh in ultimately. And to me, that is how you preserve the ultimate preservation of the institution, in my view. Senator?
Well, thanks, Speaker. I wholeheartly agree. I think you said it very, very well. The politics is messy. It can sometimes feel like a blood sport, and it can get personal. The fights that happen before you enter that chamber to get to the chamber are not always fun. But my feeling is just like the speaker is saying, once you get into that chamber, once you are elected by your constituents and you walk into that chamber, you no longer are just simply a candidate, or frankly, you're no longer just a politician, but you're sort of a bit of a caretaker of an institution. And as the speaker was saying, there were generations that came before you and they did the same. And that's why it's your responsibility to carry that on. And what we've learned, we all have different probably viewpoints on the last 5 years in America in the last couple of months, but our institutions are actually relatively fragile. right? And so I think as caretakers, as elected officials, the reason why decorum and rules are so important is because it's how we pass institutions on from one set of elected folks to another, whether you're a Republican, Democrat, or a Whig, or whatever political party you are over history. It's like our duty as a caretaker to pass that on, and from time to time put politics aside, because in the end, being an elected official and having the honor of holding that role is different, and it's much bigger than just you as a politician. And I think that's why the presiding officer is important. That's why the rules are important. That's why allowing the body to make decisions and overrule the presiding officer from time to time is important, and it's on all of us when we get elected to serve in that role in one way or another.
Thank you for that. I love all the focus on the institution. It's certainly what we focus on at the Center for Legislative Strengthening. I hate to pivot away from it and ask you a question about majority versus minority, but Senator Fenberg, I just was wondering if you could speak to the point I made about how the rules kind of serve each side a little bit differently, perhaps depending on your vantage point. And having had some experience maybe in both the minority and majority, I wondered if you had perspective to offer our audience on that.
My perspective is it's better to be in the majority.
You heard it here first, everyone.
The breaking news. You're right. The rules play a different role depending on if you're in the majority or the minority. What we say in Colorado is the minority has their say, but the majority has their way. And what that means is, in the end, the majority carries. That's who's going to decide if something passes or not. Obviously, not everything is partisan, and by majority, I think from a academic perspective, we just mean the majority, literally the majority of the people in the chamber, not necessarily the party that's in the majority. But the rules are there to protect the voice of the minority, not necessarily to protect the minority in order to get their way. But that's important, right? Because like I was saying at the beginning, a bill or a final product is impacted by the voices every step of the way in that deliberation, whether it's committee on second reading, third reading, et cetera, conference committee. If the minority didn't matter, if the voices didn't matter, then they would just stay home, right? But they do matter, and the rules allow it to matter, and it does shape policy. And that's why folks who are in the minority all over this country and legislatures still come to work and still absolutely have meaningful impact on the outcome of legislation and what it looks like at the end of the day. And so it does feel and look different. I think in some ways, as the majority leader now, I'm very glad. I didn't like it at the time when I was in the minority, but I'm very glad I served in the minority, because I understand in a more personal way sort of how the rules can be used on both sides of a debate, and also how frustrating it can be in the minority when the majority seems to want to bulldoze over you. And that's where the rules are incredibly important, is to preserve that minority voice.
Mr. Speaker, any quick thought on that before I move to the next W?
Sure. So my quick thought would be, there are challenges maybe having two closely balanced parties, but there are also challenges when you're a supermajority and a very small minority. And in fact, in the Wyoming House of Representatives now, the majority has approximately 80%, 85. I don't know. I haven't done the math actually, but I know how many seats we have. We actually have a libertarian, the first libertarian elected to a national or to a statewide office in, I don't know, 30 years. We have an unaffiliated, a single member that's unaffiliated, i.e., independent, if you will, and then my Democratic colleagues. So sometimes being a supermajority has plenty of challenges itself. The other thing I would say is, I think our rules are apartisan. At least that's the way I look at them. I think the rules are they're for everybody. There should not be. Now does the speaker or the majority floor leader or someone do that? Can they prioritize different bills, different issues because of their role, because of how they run the floor? Absolutely, they can prioritize issues. But the rules themselves are, they're they're non-denominational. Everybody plays by the rules, or that's the way it should be. Some roles are different, but everybody plays by the rules. The one thing I would say, our rules are that way, but statutorily is where we protect minority parties. So if we have a committee, we'll say, you know, there's 5 members out of the House. Well, no more than 4 can be from the same political party, even though that one party may be proportionally much greater than what the minority party would actually have, you know, just by the math. So our statute, actually, we use that to kind of do that protecting or make sure those voices and those viewpoints are represented. So that wasn't quick, but there's one example of another way to get to that protecting the minority. Thank you.
No, I love it because you actually lead into the next topic that I'm going to touch on here. First, I'm going to let the audience do a little engagement with us. If you guys could click on poll 2 on your screen, and if you know what adopted parliamentary manual is used by your legislature or chamber. So don't worry, we're not asking this question cold, it's multiple choice. So please fill out the poll. We'll be waiting to see what the poll results are. I'm hoping that they come in soon. So this is awesome because you totally play into the statistics I was going to give to you guys, which is the power of Mason's Manual. And full disclosure, NCSL is involved with Mason's Manual and with the American Society of Legislative Clerks and Secretaries, participates in it being refreshed and updated every 10 years. Mason's is the backup parliamentary manual for 79 chambers, and we just updated it actually in 2020. If you haven't taken a look at it now and you need a copy, make sure you visit the NCSL website. Jefferson's 14 chambers report using that. Unsurprisingly, Virginia chambers are among that group. Reed's manual is used in Washington. Robert's Rules of Order is another one, and some use multiple manuals. So thanks for going through the exercise and well done on knowing. And we'll talk about adopted parliamentary manuals being one resource where you can turn for guidance. Speaker Barlow touched on statutes. That's another important place that legislatures can look to when they need guidance on the rules. First and foremost is the Constitution of your state. It's the supreme law of the land, and it contains really crucial information about the organization of the legislative branch and defines terminology. Often it must be followed, and related case law matters too with respect to state constitutions. Very important is to know your adopted chamber rules. This is also a provision outlined in almost all state constitutions, and it usually goes something like this. Each house may determine its own rules, the rules of its proceedings. So as a result, knowing your rules is really important. You can access those on many, many legislative websites. I know because I do it all the time. It helps to know your own rules. And really importantly, it also helps to know the custom, usage, and precedent involved with your chamber rules. So the written rules are one thing, but how they're tested, how they're practiced, and how they're generally accepted by the body is also really important knowledge. And lastly, we touched on statutes and adopted parliamentary manual, but general parliamentary law is also a place to look. And this isn't static, it can evolve. Perhaps unsurprisingly, remote voting is a topic that maybe wasn't fully vetted and discussed, or wasn't a lot of case laws of late on that topic, but with legislatures meeting in a variety of ways due to the pandemic, it's an important evolving area to know. Panelists, on the topic of where you can look, I really want to dig into the question around custom and practice, because I think that's a fascinating part as a geeky student of state legislatures. Senator Fenberg, can you talk about custom and practice in the Senate in Colorado and how it can be just as important as those written rules we talked about?
Yeah, it's actually I dork out on this stuff, so I think it's the most interesting part. Yeah, if you look at my copy of Mason's, you'd think I was some sort of freak. It's dog-eared and highlighted and tabbed and everything.
Well, get the new copy. You can get a new fresh one.
Well, I was bummed when you got a new copy, because now I got to figure out how to transfer all my little notes on the sides and stuff of pages. But it's funny, like when you read your chamber's rules, and if you're a dork and you read Masons, you probably think like, oh, this has covered every possible situation that could ever come up. And then quickly, as you start getting into the chamber and legislating, you realize that's not true. There are always little nuances, little situations that will come up that your rules don't actually guide you on specifically. And that's where you have to fall back on custom and practice and precedent. And it gets tricky, but it's a really important part of the process. And I think it's just so, the unwritten rules are kind of the ones that are almost the most important, because they're so delicate. They're not written down. They're just passed on by tradition and by watching from General Assembly to General Assembly over the years. And to me, I think it's important. I mean, like, for instance, there's no rule that says, at least in Colorado, there's no rule that says that the sponsor of a bill or a motion is the last to speak. But every time, there's a bill in the state Senate, you're gonna always defer to the sponsor to be the one to finish up, to make the closing argument. And that's something that both sides respect. And I think it's an important part of the process, because it does show deference. It shows a level of respect, and that carries through to a lot of the climate and the culture within the building. So there are little things like that. It's very important. And the way you learn it is by, when you first get in there as a freshman, is you sit back and you just watch. That's what I would urge everybody to do if you're new. Just you don't want to embarrass yourself, but you're also going to learn a lot more if you just sort of be quiet, watch the people that have been there for a little while and what they do. And there's a lot of examples that I could talk about. In the Colorado Senate, we do senatorial fives, which is not actually written down anywhere in the rules. And it's basically just like, take a breather. Things got tense. Let's huddle over here and work out a conflict, rather than doing it on the mics when the press is watching. And usually that results in a much better outcome. And so that's just one example of something that's passed on over the years in the Senate in Colorado.
Thank you. Awesome example. Speaker Barlow.
Yeah, so I think it was well covered by the good senator, and that actually is that's an example of a custom or a practice that we do. We never, on the floor, we never refer to each other by name. We say the fine representative or the fine senator, and actually on the House floor, we don't even refer to the other body. Technically, we talk about our colleagues down the hall, but we never speak to the president or a senator X and X or anything like that. We don't speak about our chief executive. We can talk about the chief executive of the state of Wyoming, but we don't name Governor X. So it's a way to depersonalize, and that's something I think that goes to the custom and practice. You're debating issues, not each other. You're debating policy. You're not, it's not at someone's core beliefs. You're debating the issues. You're debating, and so take five is kind of an. I've not heard that one before. That take five, because I've stepped in several times, and as majority floor leader, if I happen to be in the chair for some reason, which is not that common, I grant you, but or as speaker, I've just tapped the gavel and said, all right, folks, let's take a step back. Let's understand the issue we're talking about. Let's not debate the person or the personality. And oh, by the way, you're discussing this with me. I'm the medium here. I'm the chairman of the body. I mean, or whoever's in the chair, doesn't have to be me, but that's who you're discussing this with. You're not arguing with the person across the room, or say you are discussing it to me and through me to the rest of the body and to the world. And so I think those are a couple of things that we really try. In Gillette and in Wyoming, we finally, just last year, talking about changing the rules, we couldn't refer to a physical place. We couldn't talk about Colorado. We couldn't say the word Colorado on the floor. So we would say, the state to the south, or the state with the green and white license plates, or, if it was, I'm from coal country, so, Gillette, Wyoming, I'm from coal country. So, the representative from coal country. But last year, because it became, you just get, the Rock Springs, the place where the rocks run water, you just get all, and it can be fun. And the old timers still do it. It can be fun. But after a while, we just said, okay, let's make it so we can actually name a geographic location, because But we stayed away from names. We don't do some of those other things. So rules adjust too, right? We made a choice to say, okay, let's, it just got, sometimes it got too cute. So we pulled that one back. Thank you.
Thank you. You did a great job foreshadowing a little bit of what I'll touch on in the section on decorum, and about how it's so important to direct questions to the chair or who's presiding, and not to refer to each other by their name, and make it impersonal, make it about who you're representing, not about you, the person. I want to pivot. I know we could do a whole session on what remote participation has looked like over the past year, but I was curious on the topic of where you turned to guidance. In both cases, you guys have adopted some protocols and some rule changes to allow for a virtual type of legislative meeting to take place. Colorado sought opinion from the Supreme Court about its session length, which is really interesting. I just wondered if you guys could both touch on key decisions that your chambers had to make over the past year, and where you went to for guidance. How are you doing the Senatorial 5 if you're all not in person together, huddling up in the corner? Either one can start.
I'll just jump in. I mean, it depends on the issue, right? I mean, the first step is, at least for me personally, the first step is I lock my office door and pull out my rule book and study it again and see what I'm forgetting or what I'm missing. But the rules often will specify the order of where you go, right? It actually provides that roadmap in a lot of ways. So it says, if it's not covered in these rules, you go to Masons, or if it's not covered in Masons, you defer to custom and practice, or obviously the Constitution is always going to be, I think in most places, the supreme dictation on exactly how to do things. If it's not in there, then it's up to the rules. But for me, I also call up people who have done it before me. And for instance, we had in our joint rules for the Senate and the House this year, we had Joint Rule 44, which we have talked about in Colorado ad nauseum for the last 12 months. And it basically is how do you operate when there's a public health emergency? That's the part of the rules that I always skimmed over. I never really read it in the past because I was like, I'm never going to need to know this part. And it became very relevant, unfortunately, this year. And it was written, I think, 15 years ago or whatever, during one of the other virus scares. Maybe I forget which one it was, to be honest. And it never actually got used because they wrote it after that virus scare had passed. I guess it was probably SARS is what it was. And so we put it into effect for the first time during COVID. And there were parts of it that just made no sense, right? It just in practice really didn't work. But that is where we turn to for some of our questions of what do we do in this unforeseen circumstance? And that resulted in, there was a piece in there that said, how do you count? We have a requirement that we can only meet for 120 days a year. So, we had to recess for 10 weeks. And we're like, okay, shoot, did we just burn, 70 days on our 120-day clock? That seems weird. And if there's any time we need to come back and potentially address some urgent issues, it's probably now. We don't want to arbitrarily cut ourselves off from being able to do our job. So that was when we went to the Supreme Court and we said, Joint Rule 44 says we're allowed to count the days non-consecutively, which is a weird thing to do in normal times. And we said, is this constitutional? Because the Constitution says we can only meet 120 calendar days. And they ruled, much to the Republicans' dismay, that yes, we can. We can meet non-consecutively. And so we, instead of meeting 120 days straight, we took breaks for public safety reasons. And so that's, one route. Most of the time, you're not going to have to go to the Supreme Court to ask for direction on things like that. But I think that was an important lesson. And we have made a whole lot of changes around procedure to accommodate the moment that we're living in. And I think whenever this next pandemic is, the next public health crisis, people are going to look at what we did and probably tinker with it and make some changes as well. But it's interesting to know that sometimes you are creating the roadmap for future legislatures to learn from.
And precedent, the precedents that you're setting, that weighs on you, I'm sure. Speaker Barlow.
So we did not have that roadmap. That Rule 44, I think, is what the senator spoke about. And we adjourned. So we're a little different. We can only meet no more than 40 days in any calendar year, no more 60 days total in a legislature. So counting days is really important to us. So we're very cautious. And I'll go back to the Constitution. So the Constitution says you have to be sworn in on the chamber floor for which you are elected. So that would mean I have to, if I'm going to be a representative, I have to be sworn in on the chamber floor. A senator the same way. But it does, and it says the government shall meet at the seat of the seat of government shall be the capital, which is Cheyenne, Wyoming, by our Constitution. But it doesn't say we have to actually convene on the floor. And there's two different pieces in the Constitution. That one says you have to be sworn in on the floor, but the other one says you don't have to actually serve your time there. It has to be somehow. So we use, so you take the different parts, you say, okay, if they wanted to be specific that we had to be in Cheyenne, they would have said it because they said it for the swearing in. And so there's this, you give and take. So what we did was, and we didn't have the precedent, or we didn't have those previous rules, is we look back at how we had handled previous special sessions. And we hadn't had a special session since 2003. It was for a very specific, it was for actually a healthcare crisis. It wasn't a healthcare pandemic. It was the cost of healthcare and things like that. It was a little different part of the healthcare discussion. And then the second thing is when all that federal CARES money came in last year, and we adjourned on the 13th of March. The money flowed out, I think, the 26th of March, something like that. And the legislature said, wait a minute, we're the appropriators. We're going to figure out a way where we're going to get a hold of this, and we're going to give some direction to the executive branch. So we literally did rules to do a virtual 2-day session. We did a lot of different things. We ran mirror bills. We did a lot of different things, and we appropriated $1.25 billion, set up some new programs in 2 days with these special rules, completely virtually. The speaker anchored at the seat of the Capitol, at the seat of government. The speaker and the president were in Cheyenne. I was in a hotel room in Gillette because they had better internet. Anyway, and so the precedent we had was, so going forth from the 65th legislature to the 66th, we use that as our precedent. We use the 65th, adjusted these things. Nobody challenged the actions we took. We felt that was our precedent. We had established our own precedent. And the 66, we came right in, and we had folks that were not interested in some of what we did. In adopting our rule, Joint Rule 23 is our rule. So, if someone wants to look it up, Joint Rule 23, and it allows people to, and it's pretty simple. You don't have to be on the floor of the House. It just has to be the presiding officers have to be there, and then we'll go from there. And we just completed, just so folks know, we just completed an 8-day virtual session, passed 33 bills, got about another 50 in the pipeline. So when we come in person March 1st, people will still have the virtual option. If they're not comfortable, if they're in quarantine, if they're ill, whatever, they can still participate in a hybrid format. But we have the rules set up so that we can continue out. Now, those rules are only good for 2020 general session or 2021 general session. We did not upset our entire rules to deal with hopefully is the one instance we have. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a hugely important point. Certainly a question we get asked a lot about throughout the course of the past year on my team, and that fact that the rules have been temporary, maybe set precedent, but the rules are meant to expire, or they're tied to this current situation, the current pandemic or an emergency in particular is important to know. Great discussion, guys. I'm going to move to our next topic quickly, which is, if I can get my computer to work like I want it to, is the what. So this slide admittedly is busy, but I direct you at some point to go look at Parliamentary Procedure, a Legislator's Guide, which is a we have at NCSL. It gives you, it kind of runs through these W's that I've been talking about today and gives you even more information. In fact, there's a section on common motions that I don't think we'll have time to get to today, but is really useful. This is sort of the preamble to the basic principles of parliamentary procedure. And rather than think of procedure as something that's rigid or overly technical or detailed, I encourage you to think about it as principles that impose order, openness, and fairness. And these 10 principles are really important. They relate to how decision-making for groups is governed. They include things like the group has to have the authority to take the actions it purports to take. A meeting has to take place. It has to be noticed. You have to have a quorum, which is the minimum number of members that are required to be present to conduct business. And that number can vary. It can vary depending on the type of business before the body, actually. A question has to be before the group. They have to have an opportunity to debate, must be decided by a vote, must have a majority vote to take action. And the last two deal with what not to do. No fraud, trickery, deception resulting in injury to any member must occur. And to be valid, any action or decision of a body must not violate any applicable law or constitutional provision. We had a good discussion about that just a second ago. It's important to familiarize yourself with legislative terms as well, not just those common motions and not just those principles. We talked about this a little bit at the beginning, and they can be defined differently by your legislature or chamber. Again, I direct you back to that legislator's guide as a helpful place to look. And in just a minute, I'm going to ask you guys about some colorful terminology in various state legislatures. But while I turn to our panelists again for a little bit of discussion about what you should learn, I wondered if those of you in the audience could drop in the chat some common terms that are used in your legislature, see where everybody kind of compares and contrasts on this issue. And this is my little how a bill becomes a law that, in committee, which is, if those of you who aren't children of the 70s, it's from a Schoolhouse Rock video that was popular back in the day. Speaker Barlow, I wondered if you could talk about what rules or terms new members and new staff, because we have quite a few staff participating in our State Policy 101 series. What are rules and terms that you should prioritize learning from the get-go?
Well, thank you. So I got to say something about your Schoolhouse Rock. So one of the things that I'm doing and I remember that. Don't get me wrong. I remember it. The gray hair is real. The Schoolhouse Rock. So you know what happens when you play that record backwards? Because it all makes it sound very simple, linear going forward, right? Going backwards, there's about 750 ways to mess up the legislative process, right? To kill a bill, I mean, there's a whole, it's a whole different world. So anyway, I always tell folks, look, you think it sounds.
We should do a new version of it.
Yeah, it's not all that simple. So terms, I think that as we get into the term, and I think there's different terms used in our Senate than our House. They call everything a Senate file. We call them all House bills. So there's just terms that you just have to, just small nuance type things. Resolutions versus, different things like that. So I think probably the most important thing is just the basics. We have 3 readings. They have to be on consecutive days. The first one is called the Committee of the Whole. It's not called first reading, it's called COW. The second one is second reading and then third reading. So, there's just these funny little things where you just say, okay, well, first, second, third reading, right? Nope, we don't call it first reading. We call it the COW. We call it Committee of the Whole. So there's things like that. But, I don't know that, I guess I'll have to listen to the good senator and other folks about what terms they use, because to me, I guess maybe you do it so long, it doesn't sound that funny. I mean, it isn't out of place to me. Yeah, there's one comes up, roll to the heel. Never heard it. Don't know what it means. Can guess.
Thanks, Jen.
Oh yeah, but
it's
from
feedback.
Tennessee. It's from Tennessee, so it probably means send it back to the line. Send it to the back. Yeah, I'll have to think about it. Maybe the senator has some suggestions. Cow was the only one I can come up with right off the top of my head.
That's a good one.
Yeah, cow is always the first one that our freshmen ask about, and it's funny because we always forget to explain it. So before session starts, we'll be having a caucus conversation and be like, oh, and then we'll do the cow, and yeah, I mean, you can't do that in the cow, or there's cows coming, and people just kind of be watching, and then maybe the next day they'll be like, just one question, what's a cow? It's like, oh, right. We got to take a step back and explain all these acronyms and weird terms we use, but cow is definitely one of them. We have several, right? I mean, I don't know if every state uses PI to postpone indefinitely. We don't actually ever kill a bill. We just postpone it forever. It's just a weird nuance, I guess. And then, CBEC, which is strike everything below the enacting clause, which is basically killing the bill. You just gut it. A strike below is the same. It's like a strike everything below the enacting clause, but and then replace it. So a strike below is like, somebody really kind of messed up their bill and they're just basically starting from scratch. They're just deleting it all and starting over. It's sometimes a little embarrassing, but sometimes has to happen when the bill just becomes a mess. We refer to the cow as when we're sitting as the committee of the whole. We also refer to cow amendments to the cow report as cows as well. And so we'll be like, oh, there's 3 cows coming, get ready. These are going to be tricky because everybody has to take a recorded vote, and they're kind of the thing you give your colleagues a heads up about. So those are a couple that come to mind. There's probably a ton that I'm spacing on that I use on a daily basis.
Those are good. I like all the cow focus is really is a good one. It makes me think of a tradition in Colorado around the stock show, which happens not too far off of the legislature convenes in January. So it kind of makes sense to me. Some common terms that you'll find in that parliamentary guide that I mentioned are quorum. We talked about that a little bit already. Is it a bill or is it a file? Knowing what bill is, knowing how your legislature defines motion. What's a question? That can vary within the same body even. What's the difference between a parliamentary inquiry, which is sort of like I'm lost, can you help me figure out what's going on, versus a point of order, which seeks to raise maybe an objection or to slow the body down about something that they're doing. Knowing that difference is important, and knowing when to do a point of order is important because you got to do it at the right point in the process. What's germane? We touched on that term a little bit later. And what's a vote? Typically, it's a formal expression of the body, but kind of knowing the rules around that is really important. I'm going to go back to my screen really quick and let you guys do the last poll, which is not about Schoolhouse Rock, but it is about, if you click on the third poll, a series of legislative terms from different states is going to pop up. And audience, I want you to choose among those listed, which is not a procedure or parliamentary procedure term. See if you can guess the right answer. And I'm sorry, panelists, I don't think you can see the options. We have a little bit of a delay, so bear with us as we wait to see what your feedback is, which is not a legislative process term. All right, keep voting, keep voting. Seeing some support for note from mother. 50% of you think that is not one. All right, I'm going to close the poll. So nobody picked Ulcer Gulch. I'm really sad about this. So as you can see, each of the 4 smoke out, catfish amendment, note from mother, and double jointing are all procedure terms, process terms. You can go to legislative websites and find these. Something helpful that I should have mentioned is many legislatures have glossaries of legislative terms. We have one at NCSL that I could send to follow up. We could put in the resource list, but legislatures and legislative bodies themselves create glossaries, and you can go find some of these. Smokeout in South Dakota has been around for a really long time. You can see here, I won't read everything to you, but note from mother is legitimate. That's in Oregon. It concerns a note from a legislator or committee administrator authorizing ledge counsel with someone who's working on the bill. Ulcer Gulch is a legislative term, but not a process term. It is a slang term for an area in Washington's legislative building used by lobbyists and the general public for telephone calls and messages. So sorry, I stumped you guys on that one. I thought someone would maybe pick it. Thanks for playing. So the last W that I want to cover is, if I can get my slide deck to work like I want it to, is who. Who can you turn to? And we talked about this. You have two of those people before you today as part of this session. Who can you turn to for guidance or for insight about the rules themselves and using the rules? Senator Fenberg, I managed to get a shot of you there on the floor, though I'm not sure at what point in session it would have been. But the presiding officer, the Speaker Barlows of the world, are definitely a resource for you. The presiding officer has a variety of responsibilities and duties for the body. They act as the chamber spokesperson. They appoint committee chairs and members, refer bills to committee, preside over floor session, control debate, rules on parliamentary questions. Definitely a great resource if you have a question about the rules. You can turn to legislative leaders like the majority leader, the minority leader, the floor leaders, or the whips for questions on different angles and aspects of the process. We haven't talked a lot about the committee process, but that's a hugely important place to learn the rules and to learn about the legislative process, because it's a very common experience, right? Committees do the homework of the legislature, and often the proceedings can maybe be a little bit more informal. You also might have to know how the committee rules and how they differ from rules that govern proceedings on the floor. So committee chairs can be a great resource. Experienced members are also doing this training for years and years. We always try to pull in experienced members from different legislatures, because just as they can talk to you about those custom usage and precedent things, they can talk to you about advice, unwritten rules of the body, and importantly, when not to use the rules. And so I've heard folks say that that's just as important as of a skill as being a legislator as learning when to use them. From the staff perspective, the chief officer of the body is a great resource. That usually is the secretary of the Senate or the chief clerk, who is the oldest staffing position actually in state legislatures, with roots dating back to I believe the 12th century. And they provide legislative record keeping and process bills and legislation. They often also serve as parliamentarian, although in some legislative chambers that is a separate position. And finally, council, committee staff, partisan staff, they can all be helpful resources to you as you're learning the rules and finding your way. Panelists, I'm bringing you back. And I wondered if we've got about 15 minutes left. I think that's ample time, but I have a couple questions here, and one that came from the audience that I'm going to touch on first. And that question kind of gets at the who that I've just been talking about. Do you choose someone on your leadership team to be an expert in the rules, or do members of your caucus take that on and rise to the occasion when a rules issue arises? Who wants to take that one?
So I'll take it quickly. As I mentioned earlier, certainly we have a rules committee, and that is as a presiding officer on the House, I chose 13 members, including myself as the chairman for the rules committee. Now we can actually consider bills. We can do other things beside rules. We are a standing committee by our own rules. So we could take up, do other items, but the real purpose of them is on the floor. If there's a point of order, if there's a germaneness question, or there's something that comes to the presiding officer, as a presiding officer, whether it's the chairman of the COW, chairman of the committee of the whole, or the speaker or speaker pro tem, they could call the rules committee to confer with. Now, it is often that the rules committee and the chief clerk is not a member of the rules committee because they're not elected, but they certainly advise the presiding officer or whoever the chairman is. The other thing, in Wyoming, maybe we have a small nonpartisan staff, 40 full-time professional staff members, and then we have session staff with the chief clerk as part of our session staff. So in our full-time staff, we'll have, of course, our legislative director, who is someone with 10, 15, 20 years of experience in the different levels of the legislative process. In Wyoming, up until this year, we've had actually Matt Obrecht is our director, and does a great job. We've had his two predecessors also come in as session staff. So literally we had, 80 years worth of combined directorship knowledge in those three individuals. One had been there for almost 40 years. One had been with LSO for 30 years, 10 of that as director. So and then Matt has been there for 15. So we had just we have a lot of, and the good thing about the rules is, or at least when you have that kind of a depth of bench, is they've probably heard the question before. They've heard the question before, and it's not, in fact, I just I had a question, I had a member bring an issue to me and say, hey, I'm really concerned this might happen. I said, well, I'll send it to director. And he sent it to one of his, like I said, his predecessor. He said, yeah, I wrote a memo on that in 1989. I'll pull it out, I'll freshen it up, and it'll be ready for you. So we don't, now to get to the experts, there are people who self-select. Maybe this goes to the good Senator Fenberg, that are just geeks. They just like that wonky stuff. They like the wonky stuff. And quite honestly, there's about 4 of them on our floor. I may be the one that can go to the mic and use the rule and do it, but there are some really good people that know how to dig into Masons, find the stuff, and then, you know, they generally take it to the minority leader, the majority leader, or me and say, hey, if you need this, this might be a way to deal with this. So we have some really good wonks, but they're self-selected. Those they're self-anointed because they're in a different class. I'm sure the senator is part of that class.
Yeah, we don't have a rules committee in Colorado. We don't officially select someone as the rule person in the caucus necessarily. Our secretary in the Senate is the parliamentarian, and we obviously have legal counsel. So our Office of Legislative Legal Services really are kind of our attorneys. The interesting thing though is they're the attorneys for both sides of the aisle, right? So they're not. It's not the traditional attorney-client privilege relationship. They're the attorney to the institution, not to us as individuals necessarily. Yeah, I mean, it's you end up knowing who likes the rules, who cares about them, and who wants to sort of be that person that others come to for advice on the rules. And that's who you just naturally go to. So it is sort of a self-selected thing. I'm pretty into the rules, as I've said, but I almost always will gut check it with somebody else that I know is also into the rules. And you know, my colleague, Senator Dominic Moreno, is often someone who I bring it to. And those are often the people that we will choose to chair the cow, because they know the rules, and that changes every day for us at least. And there's a handful of people that we know are confident and have a master of the rules, and we'll put them in the chair more often than not, because it'll just run smoother that way.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's mostly self-selected. You sort of figure it out as time goes on.
I was going to ask, you know, you just through observation, it sounds like is a good way to understand. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good to know. I wondered if, you know, this notion of you can get guidance about when not to use the rules. Does that resonate with you? Have you been in a situation or make it anonymous about observing someone else be in that situation where it's really crucial to get that advice?
Do you mean, when you say that, Natalie, do you mean like when to let something slide and when to be more casual?
Sort of under the theme of keeping your powder dry, or, you know, if you're constantly raising points of order, you know, how does that affect your ability to be effective? Yeah, I
mean, just real quick, and then I'll pass it off to the speaker. I mean, I think as leaders, it's your job to consult with the other leader. Meaning, I you know, every morning I come in and stop by the minority leader's desk, and we talk about, like, you know, changes I'm going to make to the schedule, and we kind of run things back and forth. And I think in some ways that is what allows things to stay on the tracks, right? Is to you don't want to get to a place where you have to use the nuclear options and the rules. You know, you want to avoid that as much as possible. So that's one thing that comes to mind. I will say committee is an area where things just generally are more lax. You know, you have to call on, you know, the witness. We have public testimony. Not every committee has that around the country, but everything has to go through the chair. But, you know, when a member of the committee is kind of going down a rabbit hole with a witness, we often will say, okay, you can dialogue. I'm not going to like call on you every 4 seconds to answer questions and go back and forth. So that's kind of an example where we'll like name that we're letting the rules kind of, you know, pause for a minute. You know, there's always the ability to suspend a rule. And usually there, you know, you explain the purpose for that. Mm-hmm. And then a lot of it is just, you just get a feel for it. When is the chamber, the chamber is like an animal, right? It's an organism. You get a sense of when it's ready to have some fun and when it wants to have business done and when it wants to kind of let things fly and joke for a minute. And that's actually, I think it's really important to keep that morale and that culture to allow that to happen from time to time. Because we're all individuals. We actually are friends, even if we're at each other's throats sometimes during debate. And that kind of ingest stuff that happens from time to time and not always strictly adhering to the rules at every single moment is actually important, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah, some really good stuff there. So I'm going to kind of work backwards, because reading the room is what I think the senator was just talking about. And you can read the floor, and at least some people can. Some people can't, and that's probably one of the more difficult things for those really intense debaters, to get up and read the floor. They know the material, they know the bill, they know their perspective, they know the ideal, the idea they're trying to convey, but they forget to read the audience and read, what the mood is, and et cetera. And as a majority leader, when I was majority leader, now the senator is majority leader, there are different times in the day when you can put up a tough bill and have engagement, or you can put up a tough bill and it dies like a brick, because people are just, they're just not going to go there with you. They're just not ready for that. And so and you can use it strategically. I never tried to use it strategically. I just tried to understand, because I wanted the fullest debate we could have. So reading the room, and I'll just tell you, it is hard to read the Zoom room. I just got done presiding for 8 days over a Zoom room with 60 members. And it is really hard to read that room. It is, you just can't tell this. You can't get a sense of the mood. You can't tell. You don't know if they're, eating a Twinkie when their screen goes blank, or they're, pounding their head on the back wall. You just don't know. So reading the room. So there's one thing that I think that, and I should say something about the committee meetings. Our committee meetings are basically Robert's rules. Our session is, flat out Masons. But the chairman, and we give our chairman a lot of latitude, I think, to the senator's point of, how they want to run their committee. And it's running a committee, a more intimate is, it's a more personable interaction. Testimony, the public. I had a committee meeting one time, 106 people testified, 4-hour committee meeting on a social issue bill. Those, you've got to set a pace and a tone so that, it doesn't elevate the tension. It's people. You're dealing with people. This isn't just some esoteric idea. These are people and what they care about and things. I'll tell you the one that, two experiences in this virtual session. I had a member use a point of order, and you talked about, use a point of order for the right thing at the right time, etc. The point of order was that they didn't get their question answered. And my response was, that is not my problem, nor is that the body's problem. The point of order is, I had a question on that issue and it didn't get responded to. Well, that is, you can certainly raise a point of order, but I can't sustain that point of order. That's just not part of the process. So that was just a different one, and it was fine. I mean, nobody took offense, and they said, oh yeah, I guess that's right. It's probably not a point of order. It's a point of, The other one is, in Wyoming, in our Constitution, you can call for the ayes and noes on any vote. And I can tell you that we have members at times who just get in a mood and they just want to prove a point. And so they start calling for the ayes and the noes on amendments, on divided amendments, et cetera. And if you want to sour a body pretty quick, call for the ayes and noes a couple times in a row. And that's one where you go and counsel them. You just you just basically, all right, we're going to take a 5-minute recess, or you get to the end and you just say, okay, majority floor leader, when it was my role, I'd go if they were one of my members. If it happened to be a member from the minority party, I'd say, hey, you guys, is this getting us anywhere, or is it just making people perturbed? Because if you perturb people, it doesn't just last one bill. It's multiple bills, and it's the things you care about. So, it's just you just got to be respectful to your fellow members, because This is a people game. This is, this is relationships. My job as speaker is process, 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 and relationships, relationships, relationships. Those two things. And if we don't have good relationships, respect each other on the floor, respect each other off the floor, and process on the floor and process off the floor, then things, and the institution gets damaged and the product isn't as good as it could be. So anyway, that's an example of, one time when you have to step in and say, hey, don't call through the votes every time. Anyway, thanks.
No, it's a great example. And I appreciate that. And your lead into the last topic I want to touch on. I'm going to abandon the slide deck at this point, and because we've already started to talk about decorum and its importance. And there are two key things that you should know about decorum. It's about creating an environment that's appropriately formal for that debate, for the deliberation that we touched on at the beginning. It encourages members to prepare, to participate, and it encourages order in the process. And key considerations are stuff we've said already: not making debate overly personal, focusing on the issue that's being debated, not the person, recognizing that the person is representing a constituency. So refraining from using proper name, refraining from referring to the other branch or the other house. I love that you brought that up already, because per Masons, that kind of talks about not in keeping with the independence of the body itself when you're referring to other branches or other houses, and avoiding indecent language. You can look at examples of chamber rules. I can send you examples of chamber rules if it's a topic of interest to anyone. As you guys wind up with some closing thoughts, I wondered if you could say something about the importance of decorum, or how you see it play out in your body and why it matters, and then kind of offer up any last words of advice for our audience today. Speaker Barlow, why don't you take first crack at it?
So I think the outcome of all the things we talked about will result in proper decorum, meaning you understand the rules, you have someone to go to when you don't, the who, what, where, when, all that stuff in the end. And then some of the unspoken stuff that you just learn by observation, to the senator's point. I think once you get all those things in place and you believe them and respect them and see that they are a successful way to accomplish policy outcomes, and policy outcomes that are that are respected and honored, and nobody feels slighted in the process. Everybody got their say. I'll just make an example. On Committee of the Whole in the Wyoming House of Representatives, you can speak as many times as you wish for as long as you wish. I mean, that makes sure that the full debate. Now, when it gets to second and third readings, it's a little different. It's confined. It's to amendments. It's, we do different things, or it's a little different. But those are the type of things. So knowing the rules, understanding some of the traditions, you don't have to have them all, just the basics. That's what leads to that ultimate decorum, that ultimate place where everybody has a place. They can voice their opinion. They can feel safe voicing their opinions. And the senator will know this, and Natalie, you've seen this before. Very personal things come up on the floor in debates. Whether we just had a debate last week about a suicide prevention bill. One of our members had lost their child to suicide within the last 5 years. It was very personal. And, and whether you voted for or against the bill at the end, I can tell you, and actually the minority leader spoke right after this gentleman, and they were on different ends of that. And the first thing she said, I am so sorry. I am so sorry. Well, take care of each other. Take care of each other. If there's one thing that I've learned from, this my limited time, my 8 years prior to now, is you got to take care of each other, take care of your institution, the policy, all those things, that will get taken care of if you take care of those first two things. At least that's my view. So that would be where I'm in. Take care of each other, because on the floor, off the floor, you're still part of your state, whether it's Colorado, Wyoming, Tennessee, Virginia. You all care about things deeply, and some things will be more personal to others, to some than others. And we just have to be respectful of that place and that space, ultimately in the context of the work that we do. And it's a privilege to do this work. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thanks for that very powerful example about decorum and about the importance of the institution. Majority Leader Fenberg.
Yeah, I think the speaker said it very well. I mean, at the end of the day, it's about respect, and it's about respect for the office you hold, the respect for your colleagues, and most importantly, the respect for the institution. And that's where decorum, I think, comes from. And it's, you know, I like how you put it, Natalie. It's, you know, the appropriate level of formality is sort of one thing to think about, and it is different at each stage. I think if you're a new legislator, or if you're just in the gallery watching, you probably will get confused, because at some points it's very formal, and other points it's not formal, and you got to sort of get a sense of how the room works, how the rules are at each stage of the process. And the cow is meant to be less formal than third reading, right? That's why it's considered it's a committee of everybody, but it's considered a committee. You're not sitting as the body necessarily, and that's on purpose. That's so you can have a more full, more robust debate. And you know, we have in the Senate in Colorado, like on third reading, you sit in your chair and you listen. There's no chit chat going on. You're not having a sidebar conversation on the bench. You are sitting there and you are listening to that debate, because third reading debate is relatively short. We are not offering amendments, generally speaking, in the Senate in Colorado. You're having a legitimate discussion on if this bill should be blessed with our official approval to make it a law. And that's a sacred moment, and we should treat it that way. And that's when things should be formal, and you should give it its respect that it deserves. And, you know, I think the speaker made a really good example of the fact that sometimes it does get personal. I think that can coexist without it getting personal between people. And you know, we have specific rules that you can't impugn the motivations of another member. You can't imply that they're doing something for a nefarious purpose. We have something, a concept that we call senatorial courtesy, and there's no definition of what that means. You just know it when you see it, and you know someone breaks it, you see it, and both sides generally will come to defend the institution if someone violates senatorial courtesy. When someone is making a personal debate or personal moment, or a moment of personal privilege, when it does hit that chord, you look around the chamber, and immediately in the Colorado Senate, everybody knows at the same time, almost in unison, to stand out of respect. There's no rule about that, but the decorum and the culture of the Senate shows that we respect one another. And the fact that we do it all at once, and we do it no matter who the member is and what the topic is, means that we have respect for the institution. And that's, to me, that's where decorum comes in, and it's a pretty beautiful thing when it works.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you, audience, for watching us deliberate today. I wish we could see you and be there in person, but circumstances are what they are, and we're grateful that you were here today. Thank you to the gentleman from Gillette and to the gentleman from Boulder for being part of this panel today, and talking to me and with all of you about the rules and their importance. Maybe you're not at ninja level yet, as I said at the beginning, but you're well on your way. Congrats on your election. Congrats on your new start with legislative service if you're a staffer. And please lean on NCSL if we can be helpful on any of these issues that we've covered today, or anything else at all. We are your organization. We're here for you. Have a great rest of your Friday.